Overholser, the director of the Journalism School. Welcome to the forum. We have been having a wonderfully interesting series of forums this fall, and I am particularly delighted at today's, which is a bit different emphasis, because we have with us one of our own faculty members. Those of you who are lucky enough to be taking or to have taken Casey Cole's courses know what an absolutely wonderful teacher she is, and devoted to her students and to the pursuit of learning. Well, I'm here to tell you she is also a really extraordinary writer, and the author of several books, 8, whatever you want to call it, many of them on science, also a science writer in the LA Times, and her work published in the New Yorker and many other places. She has a new book out called Something Incredibly Wonderful Happens, which is a remarkable mix, really, of research and biography of Frank Oppenheimer, a remarkable figure which she'll be telling you more about, but also, to tell you the truth, I would say it's quite a bit of memoir, because it is clear to anyone who knows Casey that this man, with his sort of magical mix of appreciation of science and of art and of the playful imagination, had an enormous influence on Casey, who I think was already predisposed in these directions. So Casey herself is an agent of mix here in the Los Angeles area, and puts together something which brings art and science and imagination together in her own way, sort of an exploratorium transfer here to Los Angeles. So I give you Casey Cole and her new book, and we're delighted to have her with us.
Thank you, Geneva. Well, I'll just do this. I always think I'm going to read and then I don't, and I know some of you have to leave halfway through, so I'm tempted to do this backwards. But one of the things I learned from my mentor, Frank Oppenheimer, was that a lot of things should be taught backwards. History, which I had not that much interested in, when I started hearing about the first atomic bomb test turning the desert to glass and found out a little about that, I was suddenly interested in everything that led up to that moment. And it was the same thing with playing the flute with Frank. He started me on Bach. I knew nothing. If he'd started me on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, it wouldn't have meant anything. And I do carry a lot of the teaching influence that I got from Frank. So I'll talk a little about that in the New Yorker so I can talk fast. This book was not meant to be anything like this. I wanted to collect Frank Oppenheimer's writings, and I will tell you a little bit about him in a minute and how I got to know him. Well, maybe I should do that, actually. Maybe I should do this a little bit backwards. I was writing about style, politics, culture, book reviews, travel, et cetera, for a whole bunch of magazines. And I was sent on an assignment from the Saturday Review to cover this new crazy science museum that had grown up. This crazy guy was doing it. And here's my level of interest in science. Probably most of you have heard of a particle accelerator, where you take particles and you run them around and you crash them together and you get what amounts to a little Big Bang. So you could study basically the origin of the universe. When Frank told me he had an exhibit on accelerators, I thought he was talking about gas pedals. So that was my level of science knowledge at age 26 or whatever it was. I walk into this place. It is a huge, dark cavern. It turned out 90,000 square feet. There are these weird sounds and lights, and there are people running, and I hear all over the place people saying, hey, come look at this, or what's that, or no, do it this way. There's a level of enthusiasm I have almost never seen. And the people who were in this vast space, which was full of what I would call toys, except that a lot of them were invented by Nobel laureates. They were pendulums and gyroscopes and things that oscillated, and all kinds of light and shadow and extra dimensional stuff, and a lot of perceptual things, which made me realize that everything we know is so filtered through our human perceptions and the frailties and the mistakes we made, and how easy it is to be fooled, and that we really rely on guesswork. Our brain relies on shortcuts and guesswork, which sometimes actually has a fatal effect on how we see things. So I walk in, I'm walking around, and I'm looking for the proprietor of this place, absolutely enthralled. It took me about an hour before I even got to my interview. Of course, he wasn't in his office. It was this big, stinky, smoky place with little lines of cigarette burns all along the desk, which are still there, by the way, where he would leave his cigarettes to smolder. He also put them out in his pockets on occasion, which set him on fire. So I found him in his usual spot, which was rooting around on the floor of the shop looking for 2x4s. It clouded in this cloud of cigarette smoke and sawdust. He often went to work in the shop with a tie hanging down, and everybody was afraid he was going to get caught in a lathe or a table saw. He had absolutely no fear and no respect for, well, I was going to say not respect for, but very good reasons for not wanting rules. This place was extremely chaotic in many ways, and there were no guards. There is no right way to go through. And one of the things that so many wise things I heard from Frank, but one of them had to do with why there were no rules, except bicycle riding among exhibits, which nobody paid any attention to. But it was because when you make rules, I'm just getting this out of the way first so everybody can hate me, it means it's a shortcut that you do not have to decide things on an individual basis, and they very easily become tyrannical, and that once you've made a rule, it's almost impossible for people to change it, and we get ourselves in enormous trouble like that. So he took me on what he called a sightseeing trip of this place, and he started talking to me about science in a way I'd never heard, that Darwin was a sightseer and went out and looked at species, and from that saw patterns that led him to the theory of evolution, and that's what all scientists did. So eventually, after this day, he talked about a lot of stuff that was science. I'll just tell you one more thing because it's a kind of a deep idea, so I'll just get it out of the way. That it never occurred to me that science had anything to do with things like this. About fairness, for example. There is an idea that's extremely important in all of physics. It's behind all of Einstein's discoveries and everything that's happening today, which is symmetry. And you think of that as maybe a snowflake is symmetrical, but if you turn it 60 degrees, you can't tell the difference, right? So symmetry is actually a difference that doesn't make a difference. If I make that snowflake into a circle, then I can rotate it any old amount, and it still doesn't make a difference. You can't tell. If I left this room and you all did whatever, and I came back and I couldn't tell that you'd done anything, you've just discovered a new symmetry because it's a difference that doesn't make a difference. And Frank applied this to things like the golden rule. Do unto others as others would do unto you. It's because the doer and the doee can change places and it doesn't make a difference. That's why it's a measure of fairness. And he thought that, for example, civil rights legislation follows naturally from physics because skin color is a difference. It doesn't make a difference. And that if we could find in people those fundamental differences that didn't make a difference, we could really get rid of a lot of the nonsense that separates us and get to the fundamentals. So I spend this day, I go back to my office at Saturday Review and I say to the science editor, about my day, and he says, well, did this Oppenheimer have twinkly blue eyes? And I said, well, yeah. I said, well, he must be the younger brother of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Well, I knew nothing about J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was the director of the atomic bomb project, and it turned out that my little Yoda, my wizard who I'd met, had been his little brother. And I got really interested in how he came up with the ideas that he did and how he built this incredible place. There was nothing like it in the world. In fact, there is nothing like it in the world. There still isn't, although it's been copied in hundreds of countries. It's called the Exploratorium in San Francisco, by the way. And as you walk in, there's a sign over the shop that says, here is being created a museum of awareness, which is what he wanted to do, is make people aware. So I started looking into a lot of his ideas, and he had been raised in a very cultured family, very isolated. He had his tonsils out in his room. People were very afraid of germs at the time, so that he was very aware of the crazy behavior that being afraid can elicit in people, because in those days, if you just pricked yourself with something, just cut yourself, you could die because there weren't antibiotics. And so it caused people to behave in all kinds of funny ways. So he really thought that scientific knowledge could calm that down in some ways. So he studied physics. Physics was in a big, lots of revolutions going on at the time, relativity, quantum mechanics, all kinds of new things. But it was also the 1930s. And Frank thought that it was the Depression, there was fascism taking over in Europe. Frank and a lot of his friends believed that their generation could really make a difference, that they could really change things. And he joined the Communist Party for the reason that they seemed to be the only people who really cared about racism, who cared about unemployment, who cared about the Spanish Civil War, who cared about a lot of things. In fact, the tipping point for him was the fact that the Pasadena public swimming pool allowed blacks to swim, I believe it was Wednesday, drained the pool on Wednesday night, and the whites came back on Thursday, and that was it. So he joined the party. He immediately didn't like it because it was full of all these silly rules. One of them was that he had to take an alias. So thinking this was a joke, he just took it after Folsom Prison, and he called himself Frank Folsom. And in all his FBI files, that's his alias, Frank Folsom, which is kind of funny. And then Pearl Harbor happens, and suddenly everything changes. Suddenly everybody is 100% just trying to fight Hitler, because it felt like there was this wave of fascism that had a real ability to take over the whole world. And it was well known that Hitler was working on an atomic bomb. How far we got, we don't know. So it was extremely important to do this. Einstein actually wrote a letter to President Roosevelt saying you should start an atomic bomb project for this reason. He later wrote a letter saying, don't ever use it on anybody, which unfortunately, apparently, Roosevelt never got. So Frank got very involved in this. He was working at Berkeley on making the right kind of uranium to make the bomb. He was there at the test with his older brother. He talked about things like how weird a time it was with everybody being so enthralled in this that at one point they stopped. Somebody's car had broken down on the road, and they stopped to help fix the tire, and he said, we suddenly felt human again. That's how unreal this whole thing was. So they built this atomic bomb. They put it up on this 100-foot tower. It was lightning and thunder. They didn't think they were going to get it off that night. Anyway, it finally goes off, and when you read the descriptions of it, you had mentioned some of them, it's absolutely horrific. A lot of people talked about it like looking, this is what the end of the world is going to look like a new live thing. The whole desert just became tiny. And as I said, the whole thing turned to glass, and there was this big yellow, orange, green, purple cloud that just reverberated and was terrifying to all of the physicists there. They really had no idea. People were actually making bets on the atmosphere being incinerated. But at the time, there didn't seem to be any choice. Never mind that by the time they actually had the test, Germany had already been defeated. Japan was already in pretty bad shape. So there's a lot of controversy about whether they should have dropped it at all. Anyway, most of the physicists who were working on this project were extremely left-wing. I want to tell you just a little thought experiment that I thought was fascinating when we talk about what's wrong with politicizing science. There's a wonderful book by Philip Stern called On National Security, on the Robert Oppenheimer case. And it has this thought experiment. What if the people who were in charge of our atomic bomb project had decided, no lefties, we don't want people who don't disagree with us politically. And so none of these physicists from all over the world, the smartest people, mathematicians, chemists, everybody from all over the world, would not have been there. And what if Hitler, meanwhile, had said, well, I don't care if people are Nazis, and I don't care if they're Jewish, and I don't care if they're, and he'd just gotten the best people. History might have been enormously changed by that. So to make a very long story short, the bomb was dropped against the objections of most of the physicists who were working on it, on civilian population at Hiroshima. Some of the people who worked on it actually threw up when they heard this news. I don't think Frank ever got over it. And to have it 3 days later dropped on Nagasaki, which both of these were cities which were kept pristine, so they could actually assess the damage. And I think anybody had any clue, if you've seen pictures of Hiroshima, or read John Hershey's book, Hiroshima, it is absolutely horrific, the damage that this bomb did. So here was the good news. Everybody thought no more war. We have a weapon that is so horrible that nobody will ever use it, right? That isn't exactly what happened. Very quickly, the military took control, and there was a big push on to make a hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times bigger than that bomb. So think if we multiplied, let's say, what are there, 50 people in this room? What if we made it 50,000? That's a big, big difference. So Frank and his brother and a lot of people really fought against this. There was a big backlash, and most of these people were politically punished. His brother was actually destroyed. He was probably the most famous person in the world for a while. He invented the atomic bomb. You know, people thought this was for peace. And then he was just taken down because he thought a hydrogen bomb was a weapon of genocide. There was no other reason to make one. It was just ridiculous. Frank, because he'd been a communist, wound up on a ranch in Colorado. He didn't know anything about ranching. He just was exiled. The FBI was very clear to him. He was called up to testify in Congress. He talked about himself, but not about anybody else, which was actually in contempt of court. He did not take the Fifth Amendment. But the FBI hounded him and just said, you know, you have to give us names or you can't get a job. And they wouldn't give him a passport, so he couldn't work abroad. So he went to be a cattle rancher. And one of the neighbors came up to me, had all this beautiful grass, and they said, so what are you going to do about your hay? And he said, what hay? He didn't even know what hay was. They birthed cattle by his wife reading from a veterinary manual while they actually, sometimes with a block and tackle, learned this all from scratch. And he really, really enjoyed this and did a lot of thinking and writing. And then started teaching high school. There was an opening at a place called Pagosa Springs High School. And all of a sudden, these kids from Pagosa Springs High School started winning state fairs, science fairs, and they started showing up really well trained in physics. And everybody thought, what the heck is going on in Pagosa Springs? And I found out later, I met a few of his students. One of them is a guy named James Heckman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics. And we had dinner in Chicago, and he had Frank's lab book. He told me about the music that he listened to. He gave me a little book that I sometimes assign my students called Science and the Moral Life, written by philosopher Max Otto in 1947. It's still as wise today as it was then. And I said, so when was the last time you saw Frank? He said, I was 17 years old. So this is the kind of impact that this man had on people. He did a lot of, as I said, a lot of thinking. Some of the things are so pertinent to the way I think about teaching. And again, I probably get myself in trouble here, but I'm going to say it anyway. So he finally got to be working at the University of Colorado for a little while, but not long. But he was very active. So one of the things that drove him crazy was the idea of giving somebody an F. Like, why would you ever give somebody a grade of F? What is the point of that? Why not let people take courses that maybe are going to be too difficult for them and just drop out? I mean, even the W's that they do now are almost bad. I mean, what is the point, except for branding somebody, of ever giving anybody an F? So he was extremely involved. He was writing about the Vietnam War, things that I heard him say later, once in terms of just people stealing our parking spaces at the Exploratorium, and somebody said, well, we should steal their spaces. And he said, well, you know, the worst thing a son of a bitch can do is turn you into a son of a bitch, which is very good advice, by the way. But he, of course, applied it to Vietnam. I mean, a situation in which we were not necessarily the bad guys. It's probably even more obvious today, where we did not necessarily start off the bad guys in Iraq, for example. But in response to really bad behavior, we become son of the bitches ourselves. And in that way, your enemy always wins every single time because they've changed you. And if you let somebody else, no matter how bad their behavior is, change you, then, then they won. So he wanted to have a venue. He thought that the science experiments he was dealing with should be out all the time for people just to play with. And he wanted a bigger venue for it. So he found this Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. It was empty. And the point of building it was to give people the sense that they could understand things. One of his favorite stories was about a woman who went in and spent a lot of time there, and she went home and she said she wired a lamp. There was nothing in the place at all that had anything to do with wiring lamps. But somehow she had come away with the confidence that she could figure things out. And he really believed that if people had that feeling, we could really change things, because he used to say this apathetic public that we talked about wouldn't be so apathetic if they weren't fooled and lied to all the time. And that if people were really felt that they could figure out what was going on, that understanding that was really key. And I think one of the things you may have marked on this had to do with coercion and persuasion, that in order to persuade somebody of something, you have to know what you're talking about. So knowledge is valued. Coercion, which can be, by the way, grading, do what I want, I'll give you an A. Don't do what I want, I'll give you an F. It could be withholding affection. If you do this, I'll love you. If you don't, I'll be mean to you. It doesn't have to be, people think of coercion. It could be, we'll give you foreign aid, or we won't, or we'll bomb you. There are many different forms of coercion. But coercion requires no understanding. And that coercion becomes immoral when a whole society becomes based on it and understanding becomes devalued. With atomic weapons now in the world, and that's not something we think about very much, it really changed everything. And Frank talked a lot about the fact that we just can't keep doing things. We can't keep solving problems the same way we have been. I actually heard Reza Aslan, nobody was there, talking about the situation in Iran today and saying, we have to get religion out of these discussions or we're never going to move. Frank, but we had to really, truly think outrageously. Now, this wasn't a real idea, but it was along the line. Some child had actually suggested that maybe the way to, how do you stop the bad guys? I mean, people who are really threatening civilization without just making things worse and blowing everything up. He would entertain anything. So the child said, well, maybe we should just drop Jell-O, on everybody. That would kind of paralyze them, and they wouldn't be able to do anything, but actually wouldn't hurt anything. But this necessity to think outrageously and come up with really new ideas was central. And art and aesthetics had a great, you stop me whenever you want me to stop talking. Art and aesthetics had a great deal to talk with it. Art was always an equal partner in what he was doing. As you used to say, artists and scientists are the official noticers of society, as are journalists, by the way. People who notice things that other people either have never learned to see or learn to ignore, and then pass on those noticings to others. And that we needed the insights of artists who really reminded us what it means to be human, but also this aesthetic sense that we so dismiss these days, which is based on a kind of intuition. You know what a good person is. You know what ugly behavior is. The training in the arts was really, really important to it was an equal partner in the discoveries of science. And so an important part of what he did was play, that this place he built was very much built on play. Why is play so important? When he started it, he asked a physicist friend if he thought that there was anything that people ever got too old to learn, and the answer was to play. Because play means doing things for the heck of it. It means taking risks. It means not being afraid to fall on your face. And it's something that as we get older, we increasingly do less and less of. And without that, there's just no chance of coming up with anything really new. There were one thing just specifically, well, where do I go from here? Student-oriented. There were a couple of things I really wanted to say. Let me tell you briefly about the book. So when Frank gave me, he was just my crazy wizard guy. I just thought he was wonderful. I learned science from him. Then he started giving me his papers, which were about all of these ideas, and I wanted to get them published. And I did get a contract with Doubleday they wanted me to write it with him. It was terrible. It was like this two-headed monster. It just didn't make any sense. Then he died before we finished it. But I still wanted to do it. I got talked into doing it more biographical. I interviewed a lot of people. And people kept saying it's a personal story. It's a memoir. It's a story of how you somebody who didn't like or didn't think science was relevant at all got entranced by this. No, no, no. So a friend of mine who's a historical writer, Patricia O'Toole, she teaches at Columbia University. She showed me, we're online, she's in New York, I'm in LA. We're looking at the finding aid of the Bancroft Library in Berkeley. There are all these letters to Frank Oppenheimer from various famous physicists. On one side is Hans Bethe. He figured out how stars shine. On the other side, there's George Gamow, who created the whole idea of the Big Bang. So these are big. In the middle, there are about 4 folders from Casey Cole. And I thought, whoa, you know. So when I went back to look at these letters, it was like looking in a mirror at me at age 26 or 27, getting to know these ideas, going through the frustration, questioning everything, and having Frank's responses, which we did as we worked together, and then we worked together on many, many, many things, on tape, in person. There were other people who would tape them. So it did become a memoir, whether I wanted to or not. And for the first time in my life, I found myself doing things that I had really avoided, and it actually turned out to be fun. Archival research, for example, going through and digging up letters. I found letters from Frank and a friend of his, Robert Wilson, Nobel laureate, created the biggest particle accelerator in the world, artist, sculptor, also a pacifist. He and Frank were both pacifists working on the atomic bomb. And the letters they traded in the early 50s about the agony that they couldn't stop what they saw happening. And just the personal, and at one point, Frank, and he used the word bro, which I thought was really funny. Frank is writing Bob, and he said, saw my bro in Washington. And at this point, his bro is like the most important man in the world. And he said, and I told him that I knew someday he'd do something that would make me proud of him. And, you know, he thought I was joking. And what he meant was that he explained was, okay, building an atomic bomb, okay. But that he had somehow not followed through on the urgency of stopping this madness, that he had gotten caught up in the fame and the power. And, you know, when you look at the two brothers and how they came out differently, one big difference was that Robert kind of confused himself with his job. This is something that journalists I've seen happen. If you are a reporter for the New York Times, which is probably the worst place, and I have written a lot for them, and I know what it feels like, because suddenly you are king of the world. Everybody talks to you, anything, I mean, you're just the voice of God. And if you confuse that with who you are as a person, you are really in trouble, because that can disappear in an instant. And one of the things Frank used to talk about was being aware of the applause factor. When people are applauding for you, it's your work. It's the same with criticism, so that helps too. When people say, you know, something you wrote stinks, it's not you. To keep those things separate. He talked a lot about how to take things seriously and how important that was, but not personally. You know, that those were two very different kinds of things. There were just a couple of little. They're just.
Read a couple of quick things, and then I want to get people.
And then get people's.
Because did we get some books? Is Nancy here? I think we were going to order some books, but I don't know.
Yeah.
They're in the lobby.
Oh, they are in the lobby. Okay, great.
This is not even from. This is not even from Frank. This is actually something that his brother Robert wrote him. But the reason I think about it, we're also, you know, obsessed with being successful, being happy, being successful, being happy. How do you do that? And his brother wrote him one I thought was one of the wisest thing I've ever read. It was, first of all, how to please women, but then he goes on from that. And he said, one cannot aim to be pleasing to women any more than one can aim to have taste or beauty of expression or happiness. For these things are not specific aims which one may learn to attain. They are descriptions of the adequacy of one's living. To try to be happy is to try to build a machine with no other specifications than that it shall run noiselessly. It's empty. Success in an abstract, it's nothing. It will not make you happy because it's not about anything. I was hoping to get some things from where Geneva had earmarked.
The entire book.
She did, and
I really recommend this book quite highly. But then she swiped it from me, so I couldn't figure out the things I'd done.
I did. I talked about coercion.
Wonderful, wonderful book. How did he become become so wise, do you think?
Frank?
Yeah, he
Well,
had such
you
a
know,
soul.
John Ellis, a documentary filmmaker, made a wonderful documentary. All my students have to see. It's amazing. It's called The Day After Trinity. It won an Emmy. And tell me what your question was again. How did he become so wise? Said that when you've lived that kind of life, done that much for your country and your brothers, seen it destroyed like that, been exiled on a cattle ranch where you're basically, shoveling cow manure and building fences and working so terribly, and then teaching high school, which was also he realized that teaching was the hardest thing he'd ever done. It made ranching look easy, not to mention physics. But that he really acquired a lot of, deep thinking during that time. And he was always the playful one. Robert was always the ethereal. He spoke a half dozen languages, including Sanskrit. I mean, he was very intellectual. Frank was mischievous, rule-breaking, out there. He took apart his father's player piano. He told the story of where he put his hand in a knife of a butcher thing that his mother took him to, and he got his finger badly cut, and his mother said, "That'll teach you not to touch things." Well, of course, he built a whole place, about touching things. And even in art museums, we went to the Whitney in New York one time to see this exhibit of this artist, Dwayne Hansen, who makes these very lifelike sculptures of people with shopping bags and street people. And I couldn't find Frank. And there he was, kind of standing in a corner, like a statue. So it turned out that he had poked a guard, who actually turned out to be a real guard, thought he was and he thought that was so much fun that he would himself see if anybody would poke him if he behaved like a statue. So the whole life, one of the, I'll tell you a final story because it explains a little bit of my obsessions. He wanted to create learning attics. That facts are really not what's important. It's that passion to learn. And one of the examples of that is that Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller, his adversary, were, at the time of the hydrogen bomb debate, the two greatest experts on the subject, and they completely disagreed on what should be done. So just knowing facts does not necessarily lead you to a conclusion. But Frank got a letter from a guy who used to play at the Exploratorium, and he walked out, wrote a letter saying, "I wonder if the electricity exhibits are setting up currents in my gold rimmed glasses, because a few days after I visit, I experienced increased neural activity and imaginings." And that's what he did pretty much for everybody, that we walk out just with increased neural activity and imagining.
That's great.
So if that's even, what I've left out, I just...
Yeah, no, present it. Here we go.
I'll-
Remember Casey's interesting topic of memoir, biography,
Journalism.
How we know what we know.
Yeah, and I
So-
think just maybe just say one more thing about the journal. I never written a narrative like this before.
Yeah.
So to write about people in this way, and I spent 5 or 6 years getting advice from friends saying, it's too journalistic. Meaning I quoted people too much, and it's kind of funny because when I've taught, especially in my feature writing class, but also in science writing, it's one of the hardest problems to get through is that you can tell a story. You don't have to quote everything. You use quotes as part of your toolbox. But as being a longtime journalist, I was in this habit of, so I had to learn a completely new way of writing, not only a completely new way of gathering news. So,
Well, let's open it up. Anybody with a question or a comment? Anybody who wants to ask about book writing or about biography, truth, anything?
How long did your subject die before you started on this?
he died in 1985. And so...
Were there any parts of his life that you would have been reluctant to pursue with him?
Yeah, there was one, and that's a really good question. Let me talk about the memoir thing, too. And, I wasn't there for a lot of it, so how do you write about stuff you don't know? One of the things I only heard about as I knew Frank later, was the fact that he cheated on his wife. Well, I had a lot of girlfriends. It was pretty common then. And I thought about what to do. It really hurt his family. And And his son and his daughter both helped me on this book a lot. And he did he was a pretty bad father during those years on the ranch, just being persecuted by the FBI agents were coming up there all the time and terrified and so forth. And what I decided was it wasn't really part of my story about Frank, so it's in there. And the way I explained it in the introduction is John Barth wrote a book called The Floating Opera. It's a novel, but he sets it up by, it's a great deal like real life and like journalism, what you have to do. You sit on the banks and this floating opera goes by and you catch little snatches of it as it goes down the river, and then you don't hear so well and you just hear little murmurs, and then it comes back and you hear another piece of it and then it goes on. But you hear gossip from the people sitting next to you down there, so people pass on rumors and then you kind of fill in with your own imagination. And I said, this book is like the floating opera. There were times when Frank and I were together, talked every day. There were times when I didn't see him for a couple of years. And there was a lot I had to fill in. So that was my way of doing it, that I could tell you what I saw, what I have, but I'm filling in from other people's. And that was really difficult for me.
Well, you did mention the infidelity.
I do mention it. I absolutely mention it, and more than once.
Fairly straightforwardly about the pain that caused his wife.
Yeah, absolutely. It just wasn't a big part of it.
But you also thought about this book for a long time before you wrote it.
Yeah, I had actually given up, as another lesson. It was a grad student, actually was working on it at UC Berkeley, collecting his papers. He kept calling me to ask me for questions. And we sat down one day and had lunch, and I found myself, as I am now, yak, 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 Frank. And he said, you have to do this book. And my publishers and my agents had just said nobody's interested. And I called my editor at this at Harcourt, it's now Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and I had now had a book that made me a little bit famous. I had a bestseller. I had won the Universe in a Teacup. So I said, this is my next book. And they finally said, okay. And it was 5 years late. But it took not letting go of that idea for 85. We're talking a really, really long time to not let go of this idea. So,
Yeah, you mentioned about the challenges of writing this in this different kind of narrative voice.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the role of that perhaps in particular in science journalism these days, and perhaps in the context of there being a growing emphasis on having more of a voice in the way we present information.
Yeah, well, it's funny that it was hard for me because it's not like it's something I didn't know. I remember that when I first started writing, my first editors telling me you have to have a strong voice. And somehow, it got lost. But I think it's true now more than ever, and we're seeing that in blogs and people want to, especially since information is more unfiltered, and you used to know, so the New York Times is telling you this is important, or CBS News is telling you this is important. With all that information out there, it's the voice that you're going to learn to trust. So that becomes the brand that you follow that person because you read enough of them to know that, does that make sense? That you should trust them. So the voice becomes, I like this, I get this person. I want to read what they have to say. So I did want to mention the FBI files. I was going to say I'm doing research, but I don't know, I thought it was difficult. I'd put it off. Maybe you should get his FBI files. You know how easy it is to get stuff from the Freedom of Information Act? It's just like nothing. You go on the site, you form letter, you fill it out. They ask you how much you're willing to spend on Xerox. I said $50. And, arrives this pile of stuff like this, still mostly crossed out with some of the most idiotic stuff in it that the FBI report. I mean, it was just, but a lot of it, from informants, unnamed informants. It was really pretty frightening, but it was easy.
How quickly did it come?
I would say within a couple of weeks. I mean, I really don't remember, but I don't remember waiting for long periods of time for it. I mean, and the same thing with archives and letters. Archivists are the most helpful people in the world, librarians. I mean, they want to get you stuff.
These are both important lessons.
Yeah, and also just sending out, for people who might know, I send out emails and listservs, people who might have known Frank Oppenheimer, and I got tons of responses from people. So it was actually remarkably easier. But I keep finding I'm going to talk at MIT, Harvard jointly in mid-October, and I'm getting notes from people, the head of the MIT Museum, and who weren't even invited, who said, I heard you're going to be talking about Frank. When, where? I don't even know yet at the time. But influence widely spread. And once you let people know you're looking, they do tend to come to you.
Who else a question? Any of you all thinking about long form writing like this? Yeah. You do a lot of, I mean, you've gone back and forth among newspapers, magazines, books. What do you say?
Talk about that. I think it's the same. The players have changed a little bit. The nice thing about writing a book is it's basically yours. I mean, you have editorial suggestions, you have copy editing suggestions, etc. But end of the day, it's your work. And that's really nice. Very few people probably read it. If I write for magazines, which I did for a long time, magazines are very picky about their voice. They rewrite everything. News weeklies, women's magazines, most general interest, heavy editing. You reach people, but it's not your voice. Newspapers, I found it was much easier depending on the editor. I had a great run at the LA Times with a really good editor who let me do that. A little bit more freedom, but no safety net. With books, you could check facts. Magazines, you have fact checkers. Newspapers, you make a mistake, it's, you know, 1 million people are going to read it, and most of them will write to you, it seems, also. So I found that balancing off these different things was really important for me, because sometimes you want to really have your own work, and you have to just, you know, maybe not that many people will read it, and other times you really want to get your message out there. And then I found, you know, new forms, which I like recently doing radio, because it's really short. In fact, I was doing commentaries for KPCC, which were 3.5 minutes, and I thought that was hard. But then I've been doing Marketplace, which are 2 minutes, and that's in a way even more fun, because it's almost like writing haiku. So being able to do all these, also, frankly, you know, you lose jobs. The magazine business is just as bad now as it was then. Editors-in-chiefs were getting fired all the time. My ex-husband was one of them. He had, I think, 10 different editor-in-chiefdoms. I mean, ranging from Parents Magazine to Psychology Today to Motorboating and Sailing, and you name it. Editors change at newspapers. You know, you may have a great job, and suddenly it's gone for one reason or another. And you have to find something else to do. And that's how I first started writing books, because I didn't have a job. And it was actually a book about having babies. And I remember getting the contract and saying, boy, I don't know how to write a book. And I asked a friend, how do you write a book? And so you go to the, you know, it wasn't Staples, so you go to the station, you get folders, you put them in, and you put on the subject, you know, for each one, and then and that was how to write a book. And I thought, yeah, that's still how to write a book. It's like a bunch of long feature articles that you then have to stitch together.
A friend of mine who just published a book had a horrible time with her editor, because she said that the editor was insisting that she write everything in the present tense. He felt that the past and history was just too much for readers today. And so even when she was writing about something that took place in the past, he insisted that she write it in the present. Did you have any feelings of
rules
about
that
writing about things in the 20s and 30s that maybe today's audience really doesn't know much about?
Well, it took a while to get the confidence, but you know, the first person thing is just one of those examples of tyrannical rules that people make, that everything has to be like this. Well, every case is different. And you know, people who apply that are just editors that you want to run away from as fast as you can, because every work has to be taken at its own terms. So it just took me a while to have the confidence to write about things. Actually, I was reading a wonderful book on the history of the Joffrey Ballet by Sasha, which is full of some of the most beautiful writing. I've actually been marking it to show my classes in science writing, because what you have to do with arts writing is exactly the same. So you take something that is indescribable and almost not understandable, and you have to put it into these concrete terms. But I did wonder, as I was going along, how did you know he had curly hair? How did you know he was, how did you know? Because you're writing about Robert Joffrey as he's first starting this company, and it took me a long time to get the confidence to say that. So maybe you want to.
This is Sasha Annenberg, for those of you who don't know her, who's also on our faculty.
It's a fantastic biography.
Thank you. And I could throw back many, many compliments to Casey. This book is really inspiring me, and you know, sometimes you read a book and it makes you live different, and that's really the case. I think probably the same way with you. The way with the confidence the confidence to write about what one knows comes through not knowing and taking bits of evidence. It felt very much to me like I was putting bones of a dinosaur that I didn't know what kind of dinosaur it was out on the table, and that I would put these evidences, little pieces of evidence out on the table, and I would put the kneecap where I thought approximately the kneecap should be, and I would then think, look at this piece, maybe it's a curly hair piece, or maybe it's something even more meaningful than a curly hair piece, and stick it where I thought it would be. And then there was this incredible moment of threading those bones. And I remember, I mean, this was really seriously the way it felt, but it takes an enormous amount of organization and effort and scrupulous scientific application to evidence. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I threaded everything and it was still lying there. And there was this moment and I pulled the thing up, and by God, it stood! And I just couldn't believe it. It was just like, oh my God! It started to walk. And as I made it tell the story that I thought was the story that could be told. And it did. Everything fit. And right. I can't describe it anything more than that. And then the writing begins. Yeah. Then the flesh and the color right. and the muscles and the eyes and these things. And what happened, the confidence was taking huge leaps of faith in that, but also knowing the subject well enough to take those leaps of faith. And right. then when you go to the interview and it begins to fit together, and, right. and they know you know what you're talking about, and then it's sort of the masses. And
exactly. That voice of authority, which is so important, is extremely difficult to get. But in terms of structure, which I also find with my students, with me, never stops, is being one of the hardest things is how are you going to structure a story. Yeah. This idea of having all these little bones to put them, on one of my books, the one that did become a bestseller, it actually was mostly stuff I'd written for the Los Angeles Times, reworked. And my editor said, I want you to lie down all the chapters in front of you on the floor. And I thought, she's out of her mind. She was the best editor I ever had. But she was right. I looked at those chapters and they almost began to form themselves into clumps and scents. But it takes a long time, and it takes this, and we know, I'm not just making this up, because we know this from neuroscience now. I love it when neuroscience tells me what I knew was true all along. When you're a writer, you spend a lot of time not doing anything. You spend a lot of time cleaning your house, right? You get really neat closets, and you spend a lot of time. That is not time doing nothing. Your brain is working all the time, and I always tell my students, don't do your writing at the computer. It should be mostly done by the time you get, even if it's on really short deadline. You have to make yourself what looks like a big time to stand back, put all the pieces there and think, what is this? What is this? What is this story? What is this about? And that's when it comes together, but you have to have the pieces, you have to have all that in, you have to just put them out there as best you can, and yeah, sometimes it has to happen like that. You know, one time at the LA Times, and I realized I knew how to do this, I'd been covering Mars landings for, 2 weeks, there was nothing but Mars, and yeah, I was exhausted. Some days I did 2 front page stories, and the editor said, well, we want you to do, a column 1, it's like with that, the 3,000 word sort of thought piece on what it all means. And I thought, you gotta be kidding. And I had to do it right away. So I thought of this seminal moment when these little rovers went on Mars and they were in 3D glasses. It was very primitive at the time. And these rocks seemed really, really big. And the next day, this camera, the little camera actually went up on a tall pole, and it got up to the top of the pole, looked around, and the rocks were really, really small. And I decided what it all meant was that you really don't know what you're looking at until, or when you understand how you're looking, you understand what your equipment is doing, but also until you get there. I mean, it was just how easy it is for these, rocket scientists, right? To be totally, completely fooled by what they were seeing on Mars. That's what it was all about. It was about seeing and understanding and how we do that. So,
So I have a question. You said that Frank thought teaching was harder than physics and harder than writing.
yes.
So do you think teaching is harder than writing?
Yes, I think teaching is, yeah, well, Frank took teaching very seriously, so I took a lot of probably bad advice from him. But for example, if they'd been looking for him, there'd be some important meeting with funders or something. He said, Dr. Oppenheimer, isn't there something you're supposed to be doing? And he'd be talking to some 5-year-old about, and he'd say, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And for me, I mean, and Frank always used to say too that, students don't flunk schools, schools flunk students. I really take that stuff seriously. Most of the good teachers I know do, and feel really responsible if someone doesn't do well in one of my classes. My first thought is, what am I doing wrong? And that makes teaching extraordinarily time consuming, but I don't know anybody I know who's a really good teacher who doesn't do that at some level. You can do it rote, the other thing, and I will tell this story because the first faculty meeting I went to here, the whole university faculty meeting, and I swore I wasn't going to say anything, but of course I did at the end. It was about learning-centered education. I remember thinking, what else is there? But anyway, and I finally said at the end, well, this idea that you really have to give up if you want learning-centered education. And Lloyd Armstrong, who's former provost here, agrees with me completely on this. I'm not entirely crazy. Is the need to get through your syllabus. And we need to do this. Frank used the example of he used to like to go on mountain hikes, and he'd climb up and he'd find a little stream or a little secret cave or a place where fairy slippers grew, and he'd come to the top and there's this beautiful view, vista, wow, this is great. And he'd run down and he'd want to bring his friends up, but maybe they wouldn't be as good hikers as he was. Maybe they, maybe it would be late in the day, maybe it would be hot. So he'd push them up, and they get to the top and they'd see the view and they go, this is great, and they would never want to undertake the journey again by themselves. So one of the things that for me makes teaching really time consuming is I don't want to preclude those digressions and zigzags and personal discoveries that take time away from maybe you're not going to get to a certain thing you wanted to get to. Maybe that's going to have to go aside, and that also. But yeah, it's so hard. On the other hand, it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done.
So there you have it.
So there you have it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.